Hi, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episode where we sat down with Ben Sáenz himself. This episode, we will conclude our discussion on Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club by Ben Sáenz. My name is Vanessa, and this is Literally Literary, which is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP.
Well, we want to give a shout out to Ben Sáenz once again for lending his time and energy to have a conversation with us about his stories and his writing and his philosophy, and also a lot of his activism and his view of the border. Last time we finished up with Rulemaker. So we're going to take it story by story, and so we're continuing on to finish Kentucky Club Collection, and Brother in Another Language, the story of, a lot of these stories are very similar, but this one, you have someone who's suicidal, and so Charlie here gets sent to the therapist, and it seems, a story of the parents just kind of wanting to wash away their sins, right, and pass them on to the therapist. And I don't know what you guys thought about this one, but there's kind of towards the middle of the story, we find out more about the father, and father figures in this whole collection, right, are very important for better or worse, and I like how on section 2109, the way that his father died is very ironic, and
right,
and the way that the funeral, I mentioned funerals, right, and not that I have an attachment to what's morbid per se, but I think it is important to kind of talk about those things. And we had a workshop a while back about dev cafes.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was a couple years back.
Yeah.
Right on.
So anyway, the passage reads, my father was killed in a car accident. He ran a red light and took the other driver with him. A strange and ironic ending for such a careful and controlling man. Careful in the way he dressed, careful in the way he spoke, careful in the way he handled his personal finances, but careless in matters of the heart. He never succeeded in controlling his own cruelty. That was his drug of choice. That was his great addiction. And then on the following page, it just mentions the funeral mass at the cathedral was formal and disciplined, which meant that no one shed a tear. I really like this passage, not just because of the irony, but there's times where I remember these lines. It just always stick with me about how his father was, and kind of reminds me a little bit of Eddie in Rulemaker. It seems like this kind of father, except he wasn't cruel, right? But this idea also that his father had his own kind of addiction, and addiction is something that is one of the big themes of this collection, right? Is like everyone has their own addiction, it seems, right?
Right, and not necessarily to just what you would typically find in drugs or alcohol, but in traits, kind of ways we cope with traumas, or even intergenerational ones.
Oh yeah. I mean, the idea that the sense of the father is another thing that I get from this, because part of the reason I think that Charlie is suicidal is, as we come to find, and if you guys remember how he finds out that they treated his brother because he was gay, so he was outcasted from his own family because he was gay, and so I think there's guilt on the part of Charlie for not being there for him, and also that there's a sense of disconnection. It's a very broken family, I think, and you get the sense that Charlie was just never taught how to love as well.
Right. His brother is the one who showed him that, and he's not able to cope with him being out of his life. In fact, to kind of draw to the funeral and which you're discussing here, you also have the thread of tragedy, and I think that's how he describes it. In fact, on page 112, I'm thinking, I've been thinking about how Ben in these stories also draws in this idea of tragedy, and I think he uses that word in almost every story. If not all of them, maybe most of them. Right? He says, it occurred to me that my father's life had meant nothing, not even to him. Maybe there's tragedy in that, though I doubt it. Tragedy has a profound emotional quality. He's talking about, so he kind of links that to the lack of love he got from him, and how he, even going into his adulthood, he has trouble forming those kinds of connections with people. This love, this affectionate kind of love outside of lust or romance, but just love for someone, like a protective, familial love.
Exactly.
Because he feels the coldness there with his whole family there, right?
Yeah.
And all these attractive people in his family, and he even questions. I think something funny, maybe just like this is like going aside, but something Ben does a lot in his stories, and it was great having him last episode, because he just really spoke to how his writing just portrays people, him, and how did he say it? If your writing doesn't hurt, how did he say it?
Yeah,
it doesn't hurt.
It's not worth writing.
Yeah.
It's worth writing. Yeah. Or, I think all these passages have that experience, and so there's this authenticity to it. There's a lot of questioning too, right? And so something he does a lot as well. He does it here as well, as like he always questions like what people deserve and don't deserve, and all this. So there's a lot of working things out through these words that I think a lot of us can relate to.
Yeah, and character. I think he really is very good at these character studies. Because his cousins is also, you kind of hinted at it, but there's that line that stuck with me about in that same page about how we mistake good genes for virtue sometimes. Yeah. And Vanessa, did you have any strong lines from this one?
I liked on page 115, he's asking him about, the therapist is asking him about friends, and then he says, I don't have any friends. And then he asks him why, and he says, I never knew what to say. And then he says, really, you seem comfortable enough with words. He says, I have a formal and aesthetic relationship to words. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Same highlights.
Same for me,
right?
Yeah. Because for Charlie is a kind of a very sarcastic, right, with the therapist, and
Yeah.
I see that as a coping mechanism. Of course, I'm not a therapist, but like it's pretty clear that he's being very evasive about his emotions with the therapist, and David is his name, right? Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yes.
he's in David's office, and kind of it seems that anytime someone wants to pin him down, he has a way of answering, qualifying it, so like I think it goes back to like all the trauma, right? That I don't know if anyone had the passage where the father burns the photograph, and I know the other stories deal a lot with the power of the photograph, and we've talked about the power of the photograph with Black Klansman too, if you all remember.
Oh, yes.
So here it's the photograph that is burned, and there's that idea, I think you mentioned it before, Richie, that in epistemic violence, the destruction of knowledge and the knowledge of his brother's existence, right? It's just kind of wiped out, that memory, because being set at the time, there was no internet, right? And so the photograph is all that he has left of his brother. And just the idea that his father could be so cruel to do that.
Right.
Um,
He emphasizes that when he discusses, right? He's like, I was 10, I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on page 108, I think, when the erasure of his brother. It's such
Yeah.
a traumatic thing from him, right?
Mm-hmm.
He burned his birth certificate, even my pictures, right? Again, Vanessa, you've talked about his use of italics,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And he uses emphasis there, right? Even my pictures.
Yeah.
And it's kind of linked to the last line in that paragraph where he says, "Yes, I think my father is insane."
Mm-hmm.
That's cruelty, right?
Yeah.
That he describes.
Yeah.
And it's all coming from a place of like the homophobia that we see in machismo culture, to this day, of course. And I think it's very important to kind of not gloss over it. And we all had our own family gatherings, and they can be tense, right? Like you're having dinner and like they say something and you're like kind of
Yeah.
Yeah.
really.
There's definitely a generational gap,
That
I think,
too.
in acceptance, I think, too.
Yeah.
I see a lot of older relatives,
Yeah.
kind of having trouble. And that's actually this story dives into it. And even the next one, maybe even a little bit more so, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes the rain discussing this homophobia or like just reluctance and even just rage too that comes out of a parent's unwillingness to accept their child.
Right.
So speaking of sometimes the rain, then did you want to give those listeners who haven't read The Connection yet, or got into this story, what the gist of it? So the story of Neto and Brian and
Wow. Brian Stillman. So essentially, this is almost a meditation on memory from Ben. And earlier in our informal discussion before the episode, I was discussing how I really liked the frame that he does here, because the way memory works, it's always triggered by sounds, by smells, and that's definitely what's happening here. He's listening to Louis Armstrong CD in the desert rain, and these things invoke a memory from a past that he dives into. And so Ben kind of cleverly, I use the word triggered on purpose here because he points out the gun, right? And so that's kind of the image he sets up with the very first line with "Sometimes the Rain." And that's on 126 if you guys are following along while you listen. He says, "There's always a gun around, even when you can't see it." And so it's just kind of clever what kind of triggers these memories. And then, of course, the next paragraph is just kind of like a spitting out of memories that some he dives into, some he just kind of touches upon. But it brings him back to this moment of when he's about to graduate high school and has this almost life-changing connection. And that's actually one of the passages I wanted to talk about. They're finishing up high school. They pretty much have senioritis, it seems. Going out and partying. They're in Las Cruces, right?
Yeah.
And so he's reflecting on this memory, and they want to go and party and drink and hook up. And there's this moment where he walks away from the party, and he goes to sit by the riverbank in the darkness, and for a little solitude. I think he goes off to smoke, and he comes across two people making love. Right, but something that throws him off is that it's two boys, right? And so on page 138, I don't know if any of you guys had anything before, but I just think this is kind of I always like to use the phrase like a kernel of what's happening here, like the main aspect of it, what blooms the story blooms out of, and probably why it's such a memory for him, right? He's talking about these guys, and does he recognize them? Let's see. Well, anyway, he says midway towards the page on 138, "I lit a cigarette. I looked up at the stars, and suddenly the world was so much bigger than I'd ever imagined it to be. And I couldn't get the idea of Brian kissing George out of my brain. I had both of them in my head when I masturbated that night. I was trembling. I knew something about myself that I had never known. Just when I started liking myself, I hated myself again. So that passage kind of contains multitudes, right? To borrow from Whitman here, he's kind of discovering something about his sexuality that maybe he hadn't really thought about before until he experiences this. It's the age where you're discovering new things and experiences, and at the same time you have that self-internalized hate that a lot of people would probably get growing up in such a machismo culture and in this, and obviously you see this happen later on where Brian, he's found out, I guess, and his father pretty much beats him.
Yeah.
That he has to leave, and that's what this whole thing's about, the connection that they have. He really takes care of him, and meanwhile there's this whole point about how what does it mean to be a man, and I think he even has a line there that I think hit because he really became an adult there, taking care of Brian.
Yeah.
And I was really impressive. Yeah, but I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No.
What do you guys got?
I mean, I think the passage about the feeling like a man is one that you had about is it the one where they go to the Kentucky Club, or
Yes.
is that what you were thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it.
I was looking at page 146, and Brian and oh my goodness, Neto, right?
Yeah.
Neto
Mm-hmm.
go to Juarez like on a whim, and they're like, "Where should we go?" And then Brian automatically, it even says he didn't skip a beat, and he says the Kentucky Club. And his reasoning for going there is that it was his mom's favorite place. And so I feel like that's kind of like a way of experiencing what she had experienced and like being able to have another piece of his mom while she's not there with them anymore.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying, Richie, about the role that memory plays in this particular story, and also the Kentucky Club itself seems to be a place of passing. We've talked about passing in some of the other books we've discussed, and I like how for Neto he says, when they finally get there, he says, Brian asked him, well, why there, and or something like that, and he says, or he's like, well, so this is what it's like, and Brian says, what? And to feel like a man, and so there's that emphasis here on masculinity, because Kentucky Club is not a gay bar. We do have gay bars here in the border, but Kentucky Club is not one of them. And I think it's this idea of passing, or the idea of masculinity as a social construct, which we talked about with Ben a little bit too. And I think on 145 as well, there's that idea that crossing. So the bottom of that page, Neto says, I was thinking that maybe going to Juarez for a night in the town would make us both feel alive. And so I kind of saw that as going to Juarez is a sign of vitality. Crossing over, it provides that juice that you need, and it kind of hard. Ben talked about it. If you guys remember the interview, that back then, before 9/11, I would say it was a lot easier to cross back and forth, right? And here they just say American, and they don't even need to show any documentation and to cross over. And that's the way it was. And there's that line about it was just like 2 quarters, or to cross over.
Right, and we're saying it's like the 80s here. By the way, I never mentioned that, but
yeah,
he's looking back at this memory.
So I kind of like that idea of what the Kentucky Club represents to Brian and Neto.
Right.
2 different things. you had mentioned, Richie, the rain, and how this is all like a memory, and because this is another tragic story. But I like the idea, the how Ben uses that memory of the smell of the rain, the desert rain, and I that's one of my favorite smells. I don't know about you guys.
Oh, totally. I think many of us can. Petrichor.
Yeah, petrichor.
Yeah.
There you go. And the at the end, we touch back on that, and kind of I see the symbolism there as like it's a kind of baptismal kind of thing,
A cleansing.
a cleansing, yeah, of the, not really so much as a sin, but just like the missed opportunity, that he had Brian there, right? And so my passage was the 154, the letter. And this is, I think, the only letter in the whole collection, but it kind of reminded me a little bit of Sonny's Blues,
Yeah.
because, that James Baldwin, that there's an important letter in that one that kind of shows the connection between the two brothers about to happen. But this is one of those letters where he's in Vietnam, so he joins, and he goes to war. Brian does, and then he confesses here. It's basically a confession to Neto. He tells him, "I think about you sometimes. I should have kissed you," on 154, "but I was so afraid you wouldn't kiss me back. When I go home again, will you be there? I promise to stop being afraid. Love, Brian." And I know you all had underscored what Neto says about this. So many things we don't do because we're afraid. And so that this is, to me, one of the pivotal points where, to me, it's an epiphany for Neto, because he realizes that it was not unrequited love, that Brian did love Neto, but because, both of them, I guess, were kind of missing each other, they just ultimately didn't, what's the word? It starts with a C.
I was gonna say star-crossed lovers. But
Yeah, star-crossed lovers, and
Star-crossed.
they didn't consummate that love. Yeah, they didn't.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Duh.
And so this is what makes it tragic, and I know
It
you
was a tragedy. Yeah.
the idea of a lot of things. I mean, it's so true, right? And this is one of those lines that really gets you, that a lot of things we don't do because we're afraid, and unfortunately, then for Brian, he does end up dying over there, so it becomes even more tragic that he didn't end up, getting together with him. Did you guys, other than that moment, did you guys have anything else about the story?
I just like that music played a big part in this one.
Like
Yeah.
what?
Who do they refer to?
Well, you mentioned Louis Armstrong earlier, so that's the first one that they mention. And then a couple of pages later, talks about Janis Joplin. Talk about Abbey Road by the Beatles. And the song She Came In Through the Bathroom Window. And they also talk about Frank Sinatra. And that one's more of a memory in the sense of, like, it was his mom's favorite. I'm trying to find the line where it said that. It's on page 146. It's when he's talking about how Brian's talking about how his dad mentioned that it was his mom's favorite place. And he says, "If your mother was still alive, I'd take her to the Kentucky Club. She loved that place. I'd walk over to the jukebox and play all the Frank Sinatra tunes they had. Your mother knew all the words." And so he's remembering that that's like the last thing that he ever found out about his mom. Like that's the last time that his dad ever talked about her.
Yeah, and it's another way to remember her, right? That the idea of music as connection, to someone, and like, and all of these artists, are timeless, and I think there's also a timelessness to the Kentucky Club itself, that you feel like, it's been there so long, and it has so many memories within it,
Right.
whether it's in the jukebox or in the drinks or in the people that they end up
The
meeting
stories
there.
that they tell, the pictures that they have
The pictures, yeah.
to keep them. Now, normally that'd be a good segue to the next one, but just a couple more notes about this. This one is, I like the music connection. My my comparative lit mind starts kind of firing in ways, and I think of he uses Louis Armstrong. That's also what Ralph Ellison uses in Invisible Man. This as a bookend even at the beginning and end of that book, which is one of my favorites of all time.
Yeah, me
What
too.
did I do to be so black and blue? Here he's listening to Louis Armstrong at the beginning and end of this story, right? So like I'm triggering that little bit of a memory here.
Yeah.
But kind of a last note, I like the way these two stories we talked about in this episode. He uses we have talked about it in other episodes, but this again re-examining masculinity and what that means. In these situations, you have in the first one you have Charlie who has a hard time connecting with his emotions, and he breaks down crying, and in this office when he really lets it out, and he's howling. He uses that word specifically, howling, and that to me conjures up images of King Lear, right? Shakespeare, howling in the desert, losing with the same connection. He loses this connection to his daughters.
Yeah.
And of course, this moment of vulnerability of these two boys about to be men, and discovering their identity, a little bit of more of who they are, kind of falling in love a little bit, but really just stepping up, I think, right? Taking care, the way that he takes care of Brian. And that's I think on page 153 is the line I was thinking of earlier that I was mentioning, when it's completely clear that Brian has no business staying around. He needs to leave his father. He needs to leave his house, and so he helps him move. He helps him find a bus ticket, and so the bottom of that page there, right? Obviously, it's very emotional. They even call Jorge so you can say bye to him. He says, I let my tears get lost among the falling drops of rain. Becoming a man didn't feel anything like I thought it was going to feel. To him, it's taking responsibility and taking care of someone else. And that's really, I think, what's brought up, this whole thing with the rain, listening to Louis Armstrong. And as he says, like a memory, the gun, the trigger, the finger. And it's pretty beautiful story, right? When I think about it that way. He even says right at the end, it was almost like a song.
Yeah. And I kind of see another ritual here, when he's sticking his hands out, and it's like communion. It's like I've mentioned that this story is about rituals that we enact that aren't necessarily tied to, something that is organized, right? That you just kind of, they come out of the blue, or out of the blues in this case, right? And so I think there's also that as a way of processing the trauma of losing Brian, two ways. I think, he lost him twice, right? One in Vietnam, the other before he was in Vietnam, because they never, like I said, ended up having the relationship that he wanted. So I think that, that kind of relationship everyone can relate to, where you just, like you said, the idea of star-crossed lovers.
Part of life, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's chase that dragon, huh?
Yeah. So this one, Ben did talk about a little bit. But what did you guys think about the story of Carmen and Conrad as siblings and growing up together?
This one was my favorite one.
Why?
There was just something that had me. This one, I don't know. I don't even know where to pinpoint it, honestly.
Hmm.
I read it and I was like, this one. I don't know. I'm like,
Yeah.
dang, let me see.
It's
I like that it starts off with a photograph.
Mm.
And he's trying to figure out where it was taken. And everyone has a different story for where it was and when it was. And then I like how he goes on a mission almost to try and find out where it was so that he can kind of understand who his parents are a little bit more. Because he feels like they were never really, not present, but like he didn't know who they were as people.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to know who they are.
It's interesting though how he relates just their images to him and his sister's personalities.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is that, because his mother was suffered depression, and so that I had mentioned that idea of a sense of the father and sense of the mother in this case, and both of them. There's that idea of the public image that you see in the photograph,
Right.
that they're beautiful people, but on the inside that they were clearly, very scarred.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
Well, I do like what Richie touched on, how he kind of compares himself, like different traits of himself and different traits of his sister
Mm-hmm.
to the traits of his parents. And he's like, I'm like my mom in this way, or I'm like my dad in this way. And I find that that's really interesting because I've done that with my parents too. Like I know exactly what traits I got from who.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
I mean, you said it right away, George. Like the second paragraph, he compares the photograph to public performances,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which brings up Habermas. He talks about performativity, like the public space versus the private space.
Yeah, yeah.
And, that kind of comes into play here.
Yeah, and this is a story also that, to me, hard. It's about the love between siblings, but it's also about the nature of addiction and the kinds of addictions we can have, and how mental illness, as well, because Carmen suffered from it as too, and
Yeah.
the addiction I think was just a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
For her.
Yeah, the way he talks about it, like he recognizes it there. It's not fully out yet, but but by the end, she starts really getting bad, and that's what Chasing the Dragon means, right? And it's even his sister, right, who explains it. Did you have that passage that you wanted to talk about, where she explains it to him, or?
Well, while you're looking for it, Vanessa, because I think it's towards the end.
Ah, okay.
Before we get to the idea of chasing the dragon, there's on 179, Conrad's addiction. So Carmen has a drug addiction, but this is Conrad's addiction. So he says, sleeping with men became my new addiction, but I would go back to women sometimes. The problem was that women expected more. Men felt no remorse about one-night stands. So I like how, for him, there's that recognition. I think when you have an addiction, it's important first to recognize that it's an addiction. So he has that, he's mature enough to realize that and admit it. And second, just the idea of, I guess you could say, like, very gender fluid. He doesn't seem to have necessarily an attachment to one sex or the other, but it's just the idea of why one is different from the other, that he has that preference towards men. And so it goes back to that idea of, like, gender. It just he builds it, right, he from the ground up almost, because of also the lack of his parents showing him how to love, something that we see in other stories as well. So that was my passage. Did you find the one about the dragon?
Well, yes,
or
but I actually
if you
had
have
one
anything
before.
before,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was like, I have one before.
Me too.
All right.
I liked page 171 at the very end, the last paragraph on that page, because I related to that one. It's where he decides that he's going to study English. And he says, English probably, because of my obsession with language. Well, it wasn't exactly an obsession. I was good at writing and terrible at math, so the decision was practical. And I feel like that's why I chose what I chose, because I was always bad at math, but I knew that I could write, and I knew that I was good at understanding language. So I don't know. I thought that was really interesting that I could relate to that.
Yeah, it reminds me of art of translation. Forget the protagonist, but he had also an obsession with language.
Yeah.
You know, so I think they're both similar characters in that. Not just in that, but also the of the two. I think between Conrad and Carmen, I think Conrad is more sensitive, and Carmen, being older, she's more protective of Conrad. But yeah, so that's an interesting one to think about in terms of how he's discovering what he's good at, what he likes.
Wow. Yeah. I'm thinking, going back a little, something that I really like about Ben's writing are his descriptions, and the way he describes another photograph on the top of page 162. He's to kind of, maybe this is a segue to talk about his sister and how he feels about her, and how he feels even helpless towards what he feels is her destiny. He's talking about the mom in the picture, right? He says, and I have a picture of mom looking straight into the camera as if she's daring the photographer to capture who she was. The camera lost the battle. Just kind of love that description of describing someone without really describing them, but more of like their attitude, the pose, and again, he's relating a lot of the mother's strength and personality to his sister. And so later on, next page 160. Wait, no, sorry, way off. A little later on, he's talking about his sister on page 167. They're concerned about Carmen, the uncle, aunt, and he sees his sister moving in the same direction as his mother. But something that I think makes it more tragic for him is that while the mother, as he says, my mother had been distant and sad, Carmen was kind-hearted and affectionate. I think her mental illness was far worse than my mother's. This kind of leads to this, I think, seeing her devolve in the next couple of pages out, it makes it truly heartbreaking, that tragedy that, again, we see throughout, where even he feels, I can't find the passage right now, but he feels this sense of helplessness where he sees her heading this way, and he knows that there's nothing he can do. I think a lot of people who've had people suffer through addiction and lose people through addiction understand that some people have kind of chosen their own battles, and that's the way they battle it out to the end. A little sad.
Yeah, it's just like Eddie also.
Yeah.
He had that self-destructive path, I should say, and Max was powerless to do anything about it until the very end. So now, did you guys want to?
Wait, no, not yet. Okay. Hold on. I'm like, I have so much to say on this one. Hold on.
All right.
In a way, this is chasing our own dragon.
I know. I'm like, this is mine.
Yeah.
On page 176 and 177, they're talking about where he's gonna go to college, and I find that that's kind of the attitude that a lot of people have towards, I guess, UTEP. So it starts off with his Aunt Lucille saying, I understand that you're going to this university in the fall. And it says, I almost laughed at the disdain in this university. And then they kind of tell him that he should go experience other things out of this city or out of this town is what they call it. And he says, I don't feel that way about this town. I like it here. I like the border. I like the people. And then it also kind of ties into the fact that he doesn't want to leave his sister because he knows that she's going downhill, I guess, in a sense. And I find that it's interesting that so many, because I've had a lot of people in my life tell me, you need to get out of El Paso. But like, this is home at the same time. Like, there's so many things that could be done. And it kind of relates back to the hate you give, in the sense, like, you have to grow your own community.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's
great tie-in.
something that
That's always a little bit of a privileged claim too, right? To be able to get out of a place.
That's true.
You know, like you said, people don't understand people's familial connections and and such.
And I remember back in grad school that people would say that, you know, once you graduate, where are you going, right? And so there is a brain drain. I think in El Paso that we should all recognize, you know, because it's not a big manufacturing community. You know, a lot of engineers go out of town, despite the fact that we have a great engineering school. You know, I remember everyone says it's kind of like a rubber band. You know, like you go and then somehow, some way you end up coming back. And I think to me, this has also been coming through the lines because he talked about, you know, how he had the choice, right, of going to, you know, an Ivy League school and teaching there. But he chose El Paso and he got flack for that. And it's the love of the border, you know, that his family there, right, and the intervention as he recognizes it, that he stands up for himself, you know. And I think it's hard, you know, when like you're in family or you're with family and you feel like they want the best for you, you know.
And I mean, not to say that you shouldn't travel and have different experiences, but if you have the opportunity to help your own community and stay with people that you love, I think that's also something to consider.
It's a great point, Vanessa.
Thank you.
I think for students, it's a lot of the reasons why we're able, they decide to stay. So it's kind of ironic in this one because for a lot of students I hear it's family that keeps them here, you know, and this one it's family that wants them to get out of here, right?
And the aunts and uncles are interesting characters in their own right. Something that maybe we have brought up and even maybe Ben touched on. You know, they don't really feel connected to their ethnicity, right?
Oh
It's
yeah,
about that, and the region ultimately, right?
yeah. There's assimilation with them, you know, something we've talked about. I think with Black Klansman, you know, how he passes as black and the talking on the phone. The one about the dragon is on 186, but even before the 187, I mean, I like the idea of the fatal flaw that both of them have, and that Carmen recognizes, and ultimately for Carmen is her downfall, and with Conrad it's kind of like you know, one of those cliffhanger endings, right? But you know, she says, Conrad, beauty is a fucking curse. You can look at any woman, any man, and if you want, you can take him home. They'll worship your body for a night. You'll worship theirs. It's euphoric, isn't it? And so it's ironic to me because, you know, you think of beauty as a good quality, you know, like beauty in nature, you know, the Milky Way, the rivers and waterfalls and stuff. And here, you know, for them, it's something that they're getting from their parents, you know, because this is exactly the kind of thing that even a photograph wasn't able to capture, apparently, of her mom, right? And it's, I think, prescient of today's culture that, you know, photographs are very big now, self-portraits specifically, and selfies, and as they call them. And I think a lot of people like apply like filters and stuff and do all kinds of things with them, and so I think the the here it's more about how it's passed on to them, and you recognize like there's no escape from it. This is the family curse, that's been passed down.
Mm.
But going to the part about chasing the dragon and where we get the name of the story, what did you guys want to say about that passage where Carmen explains it on 187?
I think it's interesting that the way she describes it, and she says that they're both kind of chasing this dragon, and then for her it's when she's high and she has that first hit and she feel like it finally hits her, and she says when you get a high, that first hit, that first fantastic euphoric hit, it's the dragon. You catch the dragon, and the rest of the night you spend trying to catch the fucking dragon again, and sometimes you do. Sometimes you do. And so it's interesting, I don't know, that she's like, she's spending her life, and she's dedicated her life to trying all of these different drugs so that she can catch this dragon. But then on the next page, they kind of discuss how everyone has their own dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a sense, everyone has their own addiction. Like everyone's addicted to something. And then it's on the bottom of the page. They were like their parents were so passionate about each other, but they didn't have the same dragon at the same time. For the mom, it was in her eyes, and for the dad, it was in his rage.
Mm-hmm.
And then she starts talking about the rest of their family. And so for their aunt, it's control, and knowing that she's in control and she has all this power. And then their other aunt, Susan, she leaves for a while, and when she finally comes back, she's broken, and she describes her as like a shadow because she caught her dragon, and she describes it as almost having killed her, but now she knows what that having it is like. And then their uncle Hector doesn't have the courage to find his dragon. Like he knows what it is, but he's not going to go after it, and so he just lives in a little box.
Yeah.
And then Louis, poor Louis.
I know.
No dragon for him.
Yeah.
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 Which is interesting too, because she says that's not any kind of life that she would want to live.
Well, I highlighted the end of that passage because Conrad's kind of scared of the conversation, only in the sense that he knows it's true, right? He says, stop. I'm telling you the truth. That's why I want you to stop, right? He recognizes this already as truth.
And that for all those dragons that you mentioned, Vanessa, the dragon that Conrad at first is chasing is his addiction to sex with both men and women, but later on he has that epiphany that it's Carmen, that he feels disconnected, and he feels that she's gonna be the dragon that he's never gonna catch, and so there's that realization, because of how she's going in this downward spiral. He realizes he's not going to be able to reach her. And there's that moment where, if you guys remember, like, she has a fight with someone, like and so he kind of acts, he kind of takes on that role of the protective one, the sibling, and stands up for her. But even from that, after that, it's still not enough. Yeah. And so tragically, the addiction, ends up in the same way that it does for Eddie, as it does for for Carmen. So that was that was chasing the dragon, and we get that ending line about how she imagines Carmen as this kind of dark angel that's calling out to her, holding the needle, and he sees himself taking it, right? And so there's kind of this idea of like kind of a dark, mutual suicide. I see it. But I think it's goes back to that idea of chasing the dragon, of whether he is going to catch that dragon. And in this case, the dragon is ultimately a dragon that kills you. But even though I don't think it necessarily has to, and it goes back to, using versus abusing something. But turning the page to the last story, the herding game.
Speaking of turning pages, like, to me, this is one of the most brutal page turns of the book.
Yeah.
With that last line, come die with me. Oh, God damn. And then you turn the page and you see the next one's called the herding game. Like, why? Why are we going through this path? It hurts already.
I feel like that's why it took me so long to read the last story, because that Chasing the Dragon, I totally cried. I was sitting there crying.
With, you think of the connections. The first line of this, because he died today, I'm drinking. Like, oh, man.
Yeah.
Here we go. Strap in.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this one then?
So this is I think we were talking about this one, and that it's a little different than the other ones, as you guys were saying, and I like the idea of how they have their own rules. So this is two men who ultimately hook up with each other, and you realize that he's actually having an affair because he's married, and and I like this one because it's like I read again, going back to the power of Ben's lines, how he's able to capture humanity and human character. On 203, just they're he's asking, like, they're finding out about each other, and I like how at the top of 203 it's like they're being a bit tentative and about whether they're both gay, because he's like, what makes you think I'm interested in men? And he replies, I'm not so sure you are interested in men. I just know you're interested in me. And, going to the next page, he's like, I thought gay men were supposed to be softer. Where do you get, and then he replies, where do you go to get that information? Ever been to an S&M bar? Nothing soft about that. And so it goes back to the idea of, a bar, and in this case, an S&M bar, and how S&M culture itself, I think, emerged out of that. If I'm not mistaken, out of like, gay culture, because it was about experimenting. And so the middle of this, he says, I look straight at him. So you're gay, not gay, curious, bi, what? And let's just say I like to speak with people I find interesting. I really like that definition of what love is, and because it's like, why do we have to label it, right? And this is part of the story where like they don't feel pigeonholed into like what kind of relationship is this. It's just a relationship, right? Like, why do we have to put a name on it? Right. In society, I think sometimes puts those labels, and sometimes you just don't fit those labels. And I think it's a progressive story in that regard,
I mean, I definitely kind of thought that was interesting what you were just saying. I highlighted that. A little after that, I think it was kind of interesting, this idea of bars as churches.
Oh, yeah.
Lost their faith.
Yes.
On the bottom of page 205. They're at the Dome Bar, which is a beautiful place.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't had a chance to go down there, this goes back to like the first episode. We talked about how cool it is to like read about places that we've been or can
Mm-hmm.
go. And Dome Bar is right there downtown.
And
Uh,
and the Plaza Hotel itself
yeah,
has a
recently renovated, and so here he's there at the Dome Bar, and he says, "I felt for a moment that I was in a church." But wasn't that what bars were? Churches for people who'd lost their faith? I'm not sure I ever had any faith, right? I thought that was a pretty interesting comparison there, especially considering, the book again. Everything begins in the Kentucky Club. And, this is kind of a place for people to deal with their traumas, their life, their addictions, so on.
and the Dome Bar itself, has that Tiffany dome, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful place, and it's more highbrow,
Yeah.
for
Oh, yeah.
sure, than compared to Kentucky Club, and it goes back. And I know I sound like a broken record here, but it's a ritual, right? Going to a bar here is a ritual, and it's secular, right? It's a secular connection to something, whether it's Tom in this case, or drinking, or passing, and in the case of the Dome Bar, that you feel an attachment to a higher power, and because for whatever reason, right, he just never felt, again, something we've seen in other stories, that they never felt necessarily that they belonged in a formal church, that you can make your own church. And I think even nowadays, like, they have these atheist churches and things like that in the US.
What a concept.
Yeah.
I know. I'm like, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds paradoxical, but yeah. So that was actually my passage too from this one.
Oh, okay.
What about you, Vanessa? Did you have another one that you wanted to highlight?
It's just a line that I really liked.
That's sometimes all we need is just a line.
I know. On page 210, towards the top of the page, it says, we went for a long drive and listened to his favorite music, and he wanted to talk. Talking could be so easy sometimes, and sometimes it could be hard, impossible. Sometimes the words were just there, and sometimes they disappeared, and there was no way to get at them. I really like that line. Because sometimes I forget that I need to talk to. Like here. I don't know. I just feel like that was something that I could relate to, because sometimes I won't stop talking. And then other times I can't even find the words to express what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll just listen.
And also, I think there is the idea of some things are just ineffable, that like you can't really grasp it. Like you either you can't find the right word for it, or like it's an experience you can't really describe in words, and I think music it becomes an outlet for those kinds of things, because it's a universal language and it doesn't have to have words in it. I was also reminded of another passage on 2:12, 2:13 that goes back to what I was saying about how this is a story about how we don't have to define something necessarily. It is what it is,
Yeah.
So
It's funny. I was just looking at that.
I beat you to the punch. So he orders a bourbon on the rocks and thought of Tom, the bottom of 2:12. I sat there and listened to the voices of the men around me. I never felt like I belonged in these places. Maybe because I didn't want to belong. Gay guys weren't any different than straight guys. They all wanted to be part of a club, to be one of the boys. I don't remember ever wanting to be one of the boys. I didn't want to play for anyone's team. Didn't want to go along with all the definitions of what men were supposed to be, definitions that were thrown around like baseballs in a ballpark. So that one really stuck with me as well, and I think, like I was saying, that this whole collection is an exploration of what does it mean to be a man, and I think, or a person, and I think the answer is clearly whatever you want, you know, you come up with your own way of looking at it,
Yeah.
instead of looking at what society says it is. And I think we get a letter here too, right? Or a note that Tom leaves them,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that's where we get, of course, the line, you know, life is a hurting game. You know, don't you know that, babe? Oh, babe, don't you know that? And so that's that epiphany, that they're thinking love is a hurting game, but it's life, you know. And so very similar situation to Neto and Brian, because Tom just kind of runs off, right? I mean, it's a really surreal moment. As an attorney, you know, you feel that maybe he got caught up with the wrong kind of people, like Saul Goodman or something in Breaking Bad. But, you know, it ends there. We get the line for the collection, of course, on 222, or I don't know if he had another one before that, but he's remembering Tom in the first drink they had. And even the bourbon, right, that is synonymous with the Kentucky Club, goes back to the white wine that he used to drink, our protagonist. And he was, you know, so it's kind of, again, he gets kind of sassed by Tom for drinking the white wine, because he says, what are you, a girl? And he says, I'm imagining me sitting there, and I do feel like a fucking angel, and I'm waiting for him. And then I picture him walking in, and he says to me, see, babe, it's true. Everything begins and ends at the Kentucky Club. I look at him and say, no, not everything, just your dreams.
Yeah. Because they explained earlier in the story, right, what that is. Like, that's a phrase you like to use all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Kentucky Club itself, you know, throughout the stories, I think has taken on different symbols. And I think for this one, you know, it kind of breaks the mold because it's a white wine that he associates with femininity. And ultimately another love lost. You know, so many of the characters end up just drinking their hearts out, right? Because he lost their loved one. In this case, literally, he's lost, you know, because, I mean, it seems like he just faked his own death, right? Whereas in the first one, you know, he really did die.
Yeah. That's something we were talking about before we started recording is just the change of tone here with the last story, and that the way everything's been going, right? And again, talking about the turn of the page from chasing the dragon to, you know, I'm drinking. He died. I'm drinking. You expect more, and then you have this revelation where it's a headline. It's a news headline, right?
Yeah.
He faked his death. Something, you know, we didn't say outright, but you know he did, and a little bit of hope there that's scattered throughout the pages of the book kind of comes up a little, right? These characters who find solace in language and words and art and painting and the desert. It's these little moments that ground us, you know, and bring us to this dream, the Kentucky Club, whatever that may be for us.
Yeah. And you know, if those of you who are listening from outside El Paso, you know, that might be a reason for you to, you know, another thing that to me makes the border special, you know, whether it's the Kentucky Club or whether it's the Dome Bar or whether it's, you know, there's the story that has that other bar that is downtown here too. What's it called?
Is it mentioned in there?
Not in this one, but in art translation. Starts with a T.
The Tap.
The Tap. Yeah.
Okay, that's one I was thinking of, but I was
I just wanted you to wriggle around and writhe around in contemplation.
I was like, I don't want to say it and it's wrong.
No.
Like,
The Tap's my Kentucky Club.
Yeah.
I have plenty of poems about that spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts on this collection, Vanessa? As we kind of end the year and look forward to the spring and our new books coming up.
I really liked this one. Like the collection as a whole, I really liked it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a little skeptical at first.
Mm.
I think maybe because it is from where I'm from. I'm like, it's about places that I know about. I was
Even
like,
with
I
that
don't know.
big sticker on there.
Yeah, even with the sticker, I was like, I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, mine doesn't have it, but yeah.
But I did really like it.
It was before it was cool.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that we made some connections, and I hope that all of you listening, by the time you listen to this, it'll be 2020, and we look forward to another big semester for different books that we're gonna get into. Vanessa, what's the next book that we're gonna be looking at for January for listeners?
We are going to be doing Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Rebay.
Which is a novel, I believe, right?
Yes, it's a novel.
Yeah. So if y'all haven't checked it out, I believe it was a finalist for the
National Book Award.
Yeah.
I think it was a finalist for another one too. I can't remember which one.
Yeah. So that'll be it for January, guys. I hope y'all ended the year on a good note. Better than some of these characters and ended in them. And we'll look forward to having you guys back, and hopefully having other special guests as we continue.
Thanks for joining us in our discussion on Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club by Ben Sáenz. Join us on our next episode as we begin discussing Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Rebay. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.